Hello friends, my name is Jess. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another video in the Purging My Shelves series. If you haven't seen the first video in this series, essentially Purging My Shelves is an opportunity for me to go through all of the books on my shelves that I'm not 100% sure that I actually like and decide if I want to keep them or not. The first video in the Purging My Shelves series went up during October and I was going through some of the paranormal books on my shelves. I managed to get rid of, I think, 5 or 6 out of 11 books. The point of this series is essentially to go through and refine my collection until I'm 100% happy with all of the books that I own. However, just because of how I am as a person and the emotional attachment I have to all of my books, I can't just unhaul them. I do feel a need to reread books just to make sure I'm making the right choice in either keeping them or getting rid of them. Thus, this series was born. For this video, I'm going to be going through some of my crime fiction books. I don't know why, but November kind of has like a true crime fiction vibe to me. That being said, however, I went through a really serious crime phase when I was younger where I read pretty much any book that involved murder, crime, lawyers, spies, things like that. I have way too many books for one video and I'm probably going to break it up into multiple videos. I think today we have 6 books to go through, so let's just get started. The first book I have is Silent Witness by Richard North Patterson. Let's just start with the fact that this book is apparently the second book in this universe, and I only found that out while preparing for this video. I'm not surprised at all. Younger me sucked when it came to buying books later in a series without ever checking. Don't know how that's gonna go for this book. I will say though, I don't think this is a sequel in the sense that I need to read the first book to fully understand this one. I think they just follow the same main character. Our said main character is Tony Lord, who as a teenager was accused of murdering his girlfriend, Allison. He was ultimately acquitted of the crime and he has spent 30 years trying to forget this event, until he gets a call from his old friend Sam, who has now been accused of murdering a 16-year-old girl named Marcy. Supposedly this has a lot of drama and suspense, which I'm all about, but I'm a little suspicious. Sam was apparently Marcy's track coach, and I'm getting the feeling that there was some inappropriate behavior with the 16-year-old girl, whether or not he murdered her, and I'm just not here for that. I originally gave this book 4 stars. I think I read it back in 2013. Yeah, that sounds about right. 2013, around that time, was probably around the time that I read the majority of the books in this video, either 2013 or younger. So my late middle school years, early high school years. Up next, I have In the Woods by Tana, which I'm proud to say is the first book in the universe. This book also involves an old crime coming back to haunt our main character. In 1984 in Dublin, 3 kids go missing in the woods, and the only kid they ever find is Rob Ryan, who has no memory of what's happened and who is wearing shoes filled with blood. 20 years later, Rob Ryan works on the Dublin Murder Squad, which, as a side note, what a badass name. But anyway, Rob has been keeping his past a secret, but when a 12-year-old girl is found murdered in the same woods, he's going to have to go back to his hometown and confront the past that he has been trying to let go of. I apparently gave this book 5 stars back in 2013, so this is either going to go really well or it's going to be really disappointing. That being said, I do think I've heard good things about Tana, so tentatively hopeful. Next up, I have Ransom by Lois Duncan. This book follows 5 teenagers who are being held hostage while their families have to gather the ransom. That's basically the entire plot. There's not much more said in the synopsis. The rest of it is just listing out the characters, so I'm just gonna read that. 2 brothers, their family frantic to find their sons, a loner whose uncle doesn't even know he's missing, an army brat whose family will never be able to raise enough money, a cheerleader who can't count on her stepdad but knows her father will come through, and now the clock is ticking. This is by the same author who wrote I Know What You Did Last Summer, so you already know that I have unrealistic high expectations that are going to be let down. That being said, I do kind of like books where the entire plotline occurs in a relatively short time period, because if it's done right, it can feel really suspenseful and you can feel the clock ticking down to the inevitable end that you're waiting for. If it's done well, I think I'll really like it. But this is also a very short book, so I don't have high hopes for it being done well. I originally gave this book 4 stars. Next up, I have Worst Case by James Patterson, and also apparently by Michael Ledwidge, although his name blends in suspiciously well and is nowhere else on the book. I originally gave this book 4 stars, but I have 2 reasons as to why I'm pretty certain I'm gonna get rid of this. The first reason being that it's by James Patterson. And in case you're not on top of publishing news, James Patterson has been sus for many years, but the most recent one is an issue with his self-named imprint. This imprint has kind of built its success on the backs of POC authors, and all of a sudden James Patterson has announced that this imprint will now only be publishing books by James Patterson himself. Thus, a lot of people have lost their jobs, authors have been getting moved around. There was a lot of concern. Reason number 2, though, is that this is apparently book 3 in the universe. That one's on me, though. But anyway, onto the synopsis. The children of New York's wealthiest people are being kidnapped, but unlike the last book, they are not being held for ransom. Instead, their kidnapper only wants to ask these people if they know the price that other people pay for their luxurious lifestyles. If they answer wrong, their kids die. Up next, I have The Alienist by Caleb Carr. This book takes place in late 19th century New York. Journalist John Schuyler Moore is asked to look at a crime scene by his friend, Dr. Laszlo Kreisler, who is known as an alienist, which is basically just a psychologist. The mutilated body of a teen boy has been found abandoned, and the two set out to build a psychological profile of the murderer based on the crime's details. If you're getting Criminal Mind vibes, I am too, and that's probably why I bought this book in the first place, because I was obsessed with the show back in the day. I was obsessed with basically any show that involved crime and murder, and we're not gonna look into that. I vaguely remember this being a short read, which doesn't bode well, especially since apparently I gave this book 3 stars, whereas every other book on this list got 4 or 5 stars. A little concerning, although I do really like the sound of this setting. I really like historical fiction, I like historical settings. Maybe now that I'm older, maybe I'll be more into it. What's up, y'all? Today is the very first day of this vlog. Hope y'all enjoyed the clips that I included. I went on a trail this past weekend and I thought it was so pretty, so I wanted to share it with y'all. And before I get started on any of the books, look at my babies. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. I decided to start with Ransom by Lois Duncan. Figured this is the shortest one, it'll probably be the easiest one to get through. I was a little bamboozled because it turns out the text is super small, but whatever. I managed to get halfway through it this morning and I'll finish it later today, I'm sure of it. Right now, I'm not impressed. Don't know how I managed to give this book 4 stars. The characters are super one-dimensional. I could describe all of these characters, like everything you need to know about them, in a sentence or 2. Marianne is a spoiled girl with grand illusions of who her father is. Dexter is insecure because of a terrible accident that happened when he was younger, and probably because of the neglect from his uncle. Jessie is the quiet girl, probably going to be the one that's not like other girls. Bruce thinks his brother is the son reincarnated, and Glenn is absolutely a psychopath who only cares about himself and manipulates people. 100%, I don't think they're going to change throughout this book. I don't foresee a lot of development here. I very, very much hate Glenn as a character right now. He's not mean out loud, but the way he thinks about his brother, and especially the way he thinks about Marianne, God, it's so annoying. Marianne's parents are divorced and she's having a hard time with it, and he keeps thinking about how her continually talking about her broken home is boring and how it's not actually a big deal, and that is so annoying to me. A divorce can be damaging no matter how old you are or how amicable the split was, so I don't appreciate the way he's treating her. It's super mean. In all fairness, Marianne's thoughts are kind of annoying. She's downright delusional about her parents getting back together to the point of being mean to her stepdad, but she's a teenager, like, give her a break. I'm sure we're gonna find out that her dad, who she idolizes, cheated on her mom or did something equally awful to her. I'm sure of it. I also want to say that this book is absolutely a product of its time. The copyright says 1966, so that's a lot older than I thought this book was, and it shows. All the girls are skinny, there's a dash of classism, there's some sexism in there for sure. I will say it's more subtle though. Like, it feels more like that's just the way people were back then, more so than it was actual malicious beliefs the way Vanished by Meg Cabot did, which I read in my last Purging the Shelves video. I don't know. I'm just not impressed right now. I don't feel any suspense. I don't feel any sort of anxiety or worry for these kids. Really, the only thought that I have is that I'm suspicious of Glenn's car accident. You find out that his car is in the shop right now because he got a huge dent in it. Bruce is the only one who knows that his brother got a dent in the car. Glenn just says that he hit a pole or something like that. That ain't it. I don't know what it is, but that ain't it. But yeah, I'm about halfway through this book. I need to go work now because I have a few clients this week. Probably going to keep reading and maybe finish this book whenever I go on lunch. Oh, then I don't know. Oh, buddy. Do you mind? Do you mind? So as you can see, I have a bit of a guest today that's making things a little hard. Are you happy now? It's about 4:30. Just finished working on my client project. I worked a little longer than I expected to, but I did finish the book. This book. And I'm gonna get rid of it. I totally called it with Marianne's dad. He didn't do anything super awful. He just is not the type of person that's meant to be a husband or a father. And then barely 2 pages later, I also got the satisfaction of knowing that I called out Glenn on his car accident, quote unquote. He hit somebody outside of their neighborhood, and it was a pretty serious hit and run because the kid's still in the hospital and they don't know if he's gonna make it. I knew it was more than an unfortunate bump. I'm just gonna get rid of the book. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough to be good either. It kind of read like a short story. Pretty superficial. There was minimum development beyond the characteristics that I shared with you earlier, and the writing style didn't feel very suspenseful. Maybe if it was longer, it would have felt more suspenseful, but it didn't do it for me. It felt like there was zero resolution at all. I'm more interested in the consequences following this kidnapping than I was with the actual events that we got. Does Bruce tell on Glenn and reveal that he hit the boy? Do Dexter and his uncle get closer after this? Like, how does his uncle react knowing that his nephew got kidnapped and he was unaware for the entire weekend? Like, how do you come back from that? Would also love to have a scene where Marianne actually calls out her father for being a piece of shit. What we got instead was a romance plot line, which granted wasn't a huge plot line, but it was present, and I don't like that. I get that everyone's different, but I just can't fathom being interested or having any romantic feelings in a situation like that. I think I'd be too stressed. There's also a touch of ableism. It turns out that Dexter got polio, and because he got polio, one side of his body is more underdeveloped. And I will say, I think the intentions were good. Lois Duncan, I think, was trying to say that just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you can't live life to your fullest, doesn't mean that you can't be successful in everything you want to be successful in. But it edged into kind of gray territory where it kind of felt like she was saying the only good disabled people are the ones who are exceptional and who overcome their disability. So I'm getting rid of this book. It's not worth keeping. I don't care about this book one way or another. I think I have at least 2 other books by Lois Duncan, maybe 3, but I have at least 2 other books by Lois Duncan. And after this one, kind of getting the feeling that I'm gonna have to read those 2 soon because they're probably gonna get rid of too. But anyway, the next book I'm gonna read is Worst Case by James Patterson. Starting with the books that I think I'll be getting rid of the most. What's up, friends? It is 2:30 or something like that, and I just finished work, and wouldn't you know it, I also just finished another book. I meant to update y'all while I was reading this, but I just started this book last night after I went to bed, and then I finished the majority of it this morning before I left bed. I had like 60 pages left. Good thing Libby had Worst Case on there, because that really helped me finish it up quick. As I predicted, I'm getting rid of this book, and it's not just because it was written by James Patterson. It's just not that great. It's not horrible, but it's not great. In terms of plot, I kind of like the premise of these very wealthy people being tested on whether or not they understand the inequality and how privileged they are in comparison to other people who don't have as much money, don't have as much security in life. What I don't like is the fact that the kidnapper was kidnapping and killing the children. I would have preferred to have them test the adults. I would have preferred if the adults were the ones who had to face the reality of whether or not they actually know how privileged they are. Honestly, I understand the motive. I understand why the kidnapper went after the children instead of the parents. It was explained pretty well in the end. The ending overall was well resolved. I wasn't left with any questions. It was just the language used in this book mostly that made me uncomfortable. This made me more uncomfortable than Ransom did. There was a lot of appropriation of indigenous terms such as powwow and tribe. There was some ableism, the use of the R slur. There was a very uncomfortable moment where they're talking about the fact that the kidnapper used multiple cell phones and they were trying to track how and where he bought them. And the detective was like, he hired illegals to buy the phone. And that made me wildly uncomfortable. That was super dehumanizing. I also feel like there was some racism in here. It felt like there was a pattern of all of the people of color being aggressive. There was also another moment in this book where one of the children who was kidnapped is a conservative who goes to Columbia. The kid has this thought process where he's like, a conservative in liberal Columbia Columbia University. He's like a spy in deep enemy territory, and I'm just like, please stop. I think it was mentioned a couple of times in this book. Like, it wasn't the theme of this book, but I certainly did not like either time it was mentioned, because I'm like, I'm not here for rich white people thinking that them being conservative makes them a victim. No. So the main character in this book is Detective Mike Bennett, and there was some stupid female rivalry between his nanny and the FBI agent Emily, who comes in to help on the case. Both women are at least in their 30s, and it was some petty, stupid stuff that really just made them look immature, and I don't think it made any sense. I didn't like the fact that there was a romance aspect to this at all. I feel like it was just a relationship of convenience at best. I wasn't a fan of it, and I did appreciate that at the end they didn't actually get together. They were about to sleep together at the end, but then Mike changed his mind, and Emily got pissed at him. She got so mad at him for saying no, which I also thought was problematic, but whatever. I also didn't care about Detective Mike Bennett or his 10 children, which maybe I would care if I had read the first 2 books in the Mike Bennett series, but I didn't want to see them as often as we did see them. I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on why this book bothered me. Part of me also feels like there's something to be said about the fact that the criminal is a man who, you know, he went about it the wrong way, but he was right in the fact that people are very privileged and they don't realize how terrible the world is going and how we need to take action and change and help other people. His heart was in the right place. He just did it all wrong. He was the criminal, and then all of the people we were supposed to sympathize with the most were the rich white people and the cops. I'd just rather not. Maybe I'll start The Alienist next, but that's the book that I think is going to take me the longest to read, so I'm a little worried about it. For right now, I need to edit a video. Maybe one of these days I'll move to a different setting to show you guys something new in the background, but today is not this day. I couldn't even be bothered to turn on my light. Hopefully natural lighting is good enough. I'm about 150 pages into this. I'm liking it more than I thought I would. This hasn't been what I expected it would be at all. First of all, I thought we would be getting flashbacks of back when Tony was a teenager and was accused of killing his girlfriend, but we get a lot more than that. The first 150 pages are back in the 60s. You get to deal with all of the consequences, and you get Tony's emotions of being accused and having to grieve for his girlfriend at the same time that he also has to deal with the fact that his entire town thinks that he killed her, which I'm glad that it did. It gives me a better idea of who Tony Lord is as a character, it makes me empathize with him a bit more. I understand why he is the person that he is today. The first 150 pages are pretty raw. At times it actually made me emotional. I really don't see how this could be the second in a series, because I don't understand how you would be able to have a first book with Tony Lord as the main character, and yet you don't hear anything about the fact that he was literally accused of murder. Feels impossible to me. As a little bit of a warning though, the first 150 pages, like I said, takes place back when Tony is a teenager. There is definitely some racism and other questionable, problematic things. It is characteristic of the time period, and I don't think it was unnecessarily cruel. The time period was racist. I don't think the author is racist. Who knows? Maybe there are things that I missed. We are just now getting to the present day where Sam is now being accused of murdering a teenage girl. I predicted in my intro that I think there was some inappropriate relationship with the girl, and I made the mistake of looking at the back of this book. If you're reading a thriller or a mystery or anything like that, never look at the back. The back literally says that Marcy, the girl that he's accused of killing, is pregnant with his unborn child. So I called that. I don't know if he killed her, but to be honest, I'm predicting that he at least killed Allison because he's just so jealous of Tony. I feel like that could have turned into some rage, wanting to have Allison because Tony had her and he wanted everything that Tony had. And that's the update that I'm gonna give y'all. I need to go get ready, maybe put some makeup on. I don't know. I'm gonna film. Will I put makeup on? Finally have a different setup for y'all today. Literally just moved a foot over. So I didn't record the past 2 days because I was in one of those moods, you know, where you want to cease existing for a little while. So that's what I did. I did finish Silent Witness. I ended up giving this book 4 stars, which is kind of a shock. It ended up getting the same exact score that I gave it last time, but I still don't know if I want to keep it or not. I have conflicted feelings about it. I definitely think it was really good. I was engaged the whole time. I guessed that Sam was the murderer, but I couldn't have predicted the exact ending. The courtroom drama was really intense, kept me intrigued, trying to figure out what side of the debate was going to come out on top. The last 30 pages in particular were super, super intense. Throughout the entire book, I was really enjoying the suspense, but the last 30 pages hit me in the face. Even if I decide to keep this book, I definitely can't read it for at least a few years so that I have time to forget what those last 30 pages were like and forget what some of the plot twists were, because otherwise it just wouldn't have the same impact. My issue with potentially keeping it is that I don't know if I can stomach reading through some of these passages again. I was super, super uncomfortable with the way that young girls were sexualized by older men. Obviously, Sam was the biggest perpetrator of it because he is the one who murdered Marcy. He was also the one who raped and murdered Allison. I quite literally gagged hearing the way some of these girls were described by these older men. At some points, Tony, the lawyer, does say that he can kind of see how it happened. He can kind of see how Sam ended up in the situation that he was in, and I just fully cannot. I'm 22, and the thought of doing anything with a 16-year-old makes me sick. I don't need to think about it. I have no sympathy. A 47-year-old man doing that, especially when he's her coach and assistant principal, no. There's also the whole moral issue about how Tony was saying that if he thought that Sam was the one who murdered Marcy, he would walk away in a heartbeat because that would have been crossing a line for him. But I don't understand why Sam impregnating this girl wasn't crossing the line for him. I also don't understand why there were no consequences to that. So they couldn't charge him, they couldn't send him to jail for murder, but everyone knows he admitted that he was sleeping with her, that he got her pregnant, and yet he was able to walk away without consequences for that. It was just a question of whether or not he murdered her, and I'm like, that obviously is a major issue, but it's not the only issue. I will say it was really interesting to hear Tony's thoughts dealing with the fact that he was defending someone who at the very least had sex with a minor and at worst murdered her as well. And it kind of brings up a lot of questions about like, how do defense lawyers do this? The toll that that must take on defense lawyers, especially when you don't know if your client is guilty or not. And even worse, if you know that they're guilty, but because of confidentiality, you can't do anything about it. It's a difficult thing to think about. And the fact that at one point in my life, I briefly considered going to law school makes me that much more interested in it. But whatever. I just don't know if I can stomach reading through this again. You do see the scene of Sam raping Allison. You're definitely present. It was very uncomfortable. I don't think it was unnecessary really, because it does speak to Sam's character and the effects that that event had on him later, and you see parallels between that event and what he did with Marcy, but it was difficult to sit through. And then you have all of the issues of that time period where you have fat phobia and you have slut shaming and you have some homophobia and racism. Granted, the characters in general do call out some of those things. It wasn't exactly a slap in the face, but it was an ever-present ache. So I'm on the fence about whether or not to keep this. We're just gonna move on from now. We'll see at the end of this video. Now, I'm a little under halfway through The Alienist, and this might be the surprise of the whole video. The first time I read it, I remember it being very slow-paced. Not the experience that I'm having right now. It's just a different kind of pacing. You're not having event after event after event after event, because a lot of this is investigative, it's sleuthing, it's talking about theories and putting together clues, trying to figure out what kind of person would commit the crimes that are happening here. And in that sense, I don't think it's slow-paced at all. Literally every page you're having something new come up. It's keeping me really engaged. I think it's really interesting. It is a little dense to get through, and it can be kind of easy to accidentally start skimming when they're talking about some of the psychological theories of this time period. It has kind of the tone of a classic, which makes sense because it takes place in late 19th century, but it's more accessible than classics, I think, because it's written from the perspective of John Schuyler Moore, the journalist, when he's like in his 60s, reflecting on what happened 25 years ago. It does have a reflective kind of a man looking on his past with regret and horror at the things that he had to see and deal with. If I had to describe what the tone is, I think I would say it's kind of like a late foggy night where it's dark and the only people that are still out at night are probably up to no good. It actually reminds me a lot of The Monstrumologist, which is right here. If my memory serves me correctly, both of these take place in 19th century America. Both of them are written from the perspective of someone reflecting on their past many, many years later. And both of them are what I would say from the perspective of more supporting characters looking on the real stars of the series. In the case of The Alienist, the real star is Dr. Laszlo Chrysler. And then in here, the real star of it is the monstrumologist, who is a scientist who studies monsters like Wendigos and things like that. The book itself is being written written from the perspective of his assistant, who at the time of these events was like 12 or 13. Probably the biggest difference is this does have a paranormal supernatural aspect to it, but the tone is so similar. I really love The Monstermologist, so I can totally see why I'm loving The Alienist right now. Honestly, I don't even know what day it is today. In the past couple days, I did finish The Alienist, and I ended up giving this book 5 stars, which was a huge surprise to me. So far, all of the books that I have read have either gotten a lower rating or the same rating in the case of The Silent Witness. So this is the only one that's gotten a higher rating the second time around. Personally, hit the vibe that I love and was maybe looking for. Depending on your taste, you might hate it just because there's a lot of foreshadowing. Our narrator, John, does sometimes give kind of spoilers. They're not really spoilers, but essentially what will happen is there will be an interaction or there will be something mentioned almost as an aside. Without John's narration, you might not notice it, but then John comes in with a line like, "How could we have known that this minor thing would lead to such a crisis later on?" So maybe it would annoy some people, but to me, since they're so vague, I don't really consider them spoilers. I think it just adds a little bit of intrigue. Another reason that I think people would have a problem with it is that you kind of need to have a strong stomach to read through this, because the case that they're investigating is the murders of child prostitutes. Thankfully, it really doesn't go into much detail about their jobs. That's not really graphic. What's done to them when they're murdered is kind of graphic. It's kind of gory, so you need to have a strong stomach for it. You'll also see a lot of the issues that were characteristic of the time. So the victims are boys that are dressing as girls, so you're gonna get a lot of transphobia. I don't think any of them are trans, because from what we get from these characters, none of the boys really wanted to do that. None of them really want to dress as girls. That being said, there is some transphobia, there is some homophobia, there's some anti-immigrant talk. In all fairness though, the main characters themselves don't participate in any of that, and they actively shut it down at times. When the transphobia comes from one of the officers originally on the case, one of our main characters shuts it down and tells them to stop. Our main characters don't support that talk, which is why I'm more okay with having to hear it. What I think is probably the biggest problem is anti-indigenous talk. The person who's murdering all of these children is a white man who is trying to mimic what he thinks are the practices of indigenous people in the West. And obviously that's really problematic. But again, what I will say is that the main characters don't support that. They actively go to historians who know more about the practice of indigenous people. Granted, these are also white people, so they don't go to indigenous people themselves, but they do more research and they're like, okay, indigenous people wouldn't do this. And I do appreciate that when they go to the historians are very clear in trying to make sure that these investigators aren't going to put any blame on indigenous people. I'm not indigenous myself. Whenever you hear somebody talk on problematic issues that they're not personally affected by, obviously you have to take it with a grain of salt, because I'm not really capable of telling what is a problematic thing and what isn't. So I'm in no way trying to excuse any of that, because it's not my place to excuse it. I can't speak on any of it. I'm just trying to let you know how those things come across in this book so that you can decide for yourself if you want to go through it or not. The vibe that I mentioned in the last clip really is, I'm starting to think, a vibe that I really like. I just loved it. I really liked the atmosphere of it. I also love how you can tell this book was really well researched. There were a lot of things that I had learned in my American history classes, but more specifically a lot of things that I learned in my history of journalism classes. And I thought that was a lot of fun, seeing the things that I've learned come up in this book and be able to point it out and be like, oh my god, no, I know about that person. I also loved hearing about all of the psychological theories going on here. It turns out that this is actually taking place in a time where schizophrenia and paranoia are just being discussed as new terms, which is super interesting. And actually, there's a note in the front of the book that says, prior to the 20th century, persons suffering from mental illness were thought to be alienated, not only from the rest of society, but from their own true natures. Those experts who studied mental pathologies were therefore known as alienists. I really like that it comes from a point of view where you don't excuse the murderer because he did a lot of really messed up things, a lot of horrible things, but you're forced to understand him. You're forced to understand where he's coming from and why he is the way he is. And that's personally what I love in psychology and criminology. It's understanding why human beings can do such horrible things. And now we're on to In the Woods by Tana French. I'm a little over halfway through. I really like Tana French's writing style. Some of the passages here really have a nice, dreamy quality to it, and I love how descriptive Tana French gets. This book also has a reflective narrator. It's from the point of view of Rob Ryan, and he also does some of those asides where he's like, we should have realized that this was gonna come up later. And it turns out, but I really like that. In that sense, I'm having a good time. But overall, I'm also really uncomfortable with a lot of the misogyny and toxic masculinity in this book, which I think is the biggest problem overall. Rob Ryan's partner in the murder squad is another detective named Cassie, and obviously because Cassie is, I think, the only woman on the squad, you hear that there are rumors that she slept her way into the position, and that's messed up. You also get the idea that Cassie is not like other girls. I don't know that I would say Cassie herself does that so much as Rob's thoughts do it over and over again, where he's like, Cassie's special, Cassie's not like other girls. And it's also really annoying how they talk about other girls. You know, our victim in this book is a young girl named Katie, and Katie has two other sisters. Cassie and Rob are theorizing that it's possible that there's abuse in the household, and they're citing the issues that the other two girls have. And one of the things that they say is that Rosalind, the older sister, is oversexual. What indication is there that she's oversexual? I don't understand that at all. Their reasoning for her being oversexual is that she wears a lot of makeup and doesn't wear a bra. And I'm like, what the hell? And there are several instances over and over and over again of a lot of women judging other women. And then there's the toxic masculinity thing where right from the get-go, Rob Ryan doesn't like this guy named Damien because he's like a soft puppy kind of character. And he doesn't explicitly say it, but essentially he's like, he's not a man or whatever. There are also some other issues. There's some casual fat phobia. There's also some ableism. There's another character later who is a suspect at one point who has a facial twitch. Cassie, Rob, and another detective that they're working with literally make fun of him. It's just uncomfortable. And then on page 15, I think it was, way in the beginning of the book, you have Rob and Cassie talking about like roughing up suspects. This is where I'm like, oh, that's why I thought I wasn't gonna be into crime fiction anymore. Which is all to say that I'm having a rough time. But anyway, I still have 200 pages left to go. If I had to guess, I think Rosalind's involved in the murder somehow. I don't know how. I really don't know. I don't know if she necessarily killed Katie herself, but I think she was involved, and I think her dad is covering for her. The final book has been finished. Hi, friends. You can see my tree in the background. Enjoy. I'm gonna hold my book here so that you can still see the tree. I finished In the Woods late last night. I think I'm gonna get rid of this. I said in the intro that I gave this book 5 stars the first time around, and I knew by the fact that I gave it 5 stars that this probably wasn't gonna go well. Again, I like Tana French's writing style, but writing style is wholly separate from what exactly they're saying and like the characters and the plot and everything like that. Rob? What an asshole. Rob and his partner Cassie end up sleeping together, which I didn't like in the first place. I really liked their friendship and I want to see more platonic opposite sex friendships in books. If they had just stayed friends, that would have been fantastic. So they did end up sleeping together, but Rob was so cruel in the way he treated Cassie afterwards. He just cut all contact with her, essentially. Bare minimum contact that he had to have with her because of the case. He started accusing her of things later on, like accusing her of sharing his darkest secret. He's such an uncommunicative child. And then the way he acts over Rosalind is ridiculous. He literally had a moment where he considered sleeping with Rosalind even though she was 18, he's like 32, and she's also the sister of the victim in his murder case. Like, are you kidding? It was just ridiculous. And he got so sucked into Rosalind's orbit to the point where he was accusing Cassie of things even though they've been partners for years, and at that point, there should be some trust there. Speaking of Rosalind, I was right. Rosalind wasn't the one who committed the murder, but she was the one who planned it all. I thought it was pretty interesting. I don't necessarily think the depiction of psychopaths in this book is completely accurate. I don't know, I think it might have been a bit exaggerated. It was interesting, that's for sure. And I kind of appreciated the fact that Rosalind was never charged with anything. I like not having every single case in every book work out. That being said, the case with Katie was resolved. The case with Rob and what happened to him when he was a kid 20 years ago was never resolved. And I was okay with that at first because I know this is the first book in a series until I looked up the series and I realized the Dublin Murder Squad series is very very loosely connected. Each book follows a different member of the squad, and none of the books follow Rob after this. We still don't know what happened 20 years ago, and that's super annoying to me. And after reading this book and reading about another 30-something middle-aged guy lusting after a teen girl, I'm probably gonna get rid of Silent Witness too, because I'm kind of sick of it. But honestly, I'm more reluctant to get rid of Silent Witness just because I really enjoyed the courtroom drama of it. I was gonna do the whole nice setup with my DSLR for this outro, and then I just decided if you made it to the end of this video, then you're probably one of my real friends, in which case I don't gotta pull out the fancy equipment for y'all, so we're not gonna do that. I'm just gonna give y'all a quick rundown of where we left off with these books, what I ended up deciding. I'm happy to say that out of these 5 books, I am getting rid of 4 of them. Y'all already knew that I was gonna get rid of Ransom by Lois Duncan. It wasn't bad, it's just not good enough for me to keep it. I'm never really gonna want to read it again because it was kind of boring. Obviously, I'm getting rid of Worst Case by James Patterson. Again, just not good enough for me to keep it. There were kind of a few problematic things. I really didn't care about the main character or his life, so I'm not gonna want to read about that again. Silent Witness. This is the one that I was most on the fence about. I couldn't decide if I wanted to keep it or not. Ultimately, I decided that I'm gonna get rid of it just because while I really enjoyed the courtroom drama, I was just gonna be too uncomfortable to read those topics again. And honestly, that's not even the biggest thing because I have a pretty strong stomach. I'm pretty desensitized to things, but the way it was treated in this book, I feel like it could have been done better. And after reading The Alienist and other books where problematic topics are addressed appropriately, this book definitely could have done better. Plus, like I mentioned, I can't read this book for a few years anyway, or else I would still be able to remember the last 30 pages, and that's where it really, really got good. Generally, it can stand on its own, but it just wouldn't have the same impact without those last 30 pages and the surprise factor with it. Might pick up other books by this author though, I will say that. The Alienist is the only book that I am going to keep out of these 5. Honestly, was the shocker of the whole video since it got 5 stars. It started with the lowest rating and now it's finishing with the highest rating, which is part of the reason why I like doing this series, is finding new favorites and realizing books that didn't work for me back then work for me now. And then In the Woods by Tana. I am getting rid of it. Y'all just saw the clips about it, so I'm sure you can guess why. It just felt too problematic for me to keep it, and I'm still annoyed about the fact that we didn't get the answer to the whole mystery from 20 years ago. Will I read other Tana French books? Maybe. So personally, I think this was a pretty successful purging my shelves episode since I got rid of most of the books here and I have cleared some space on my shelves. I'm pretty happy about that. I hope you guys enjoyed watching my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoy having more of a spoilery video here. I just think it's a lot more entertaining that way. And again, if you want to hear a spoiler-free review of any of these, although it's a little bit late now, wait for my wrap-up, which will come out eventually. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll already know that I've been having a lot of trouble with Premiere, and just emotionally, I'm not at my best right now. I'm not bad. Don't worry about me. It's been a little hard keeping on top of my schedule. I'm the kind of person where if I slip up on a schedule once, I get kind of knocked off the road entirely, and it's hard to find my way back. I'm working on getting back to my regular schedule of videos, but I will say that 2 videos a week is a little bit too much. It essentially becomes a full-time job, which is not helpful in my pursuit to find a real full-time job. So I might be cutting it down to 1 video a week minimum and then put out more videos as they come. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about that, if y'all are okay with it. If you're not okay with it, in all honesty, it's still my choice and I'm gonna do what's best for me, but I like to hear your comments and concerns. Either way, I love you guys. Thank you so much for 100 subscribers. It really, really made my day when I found out. I really appreciate all of the support that y'all have given me. If you're new here and you're not one of those 100 subscribers, you should definitely subscribe. I like to think that I make fun content. Comment, like, subscribe, do all of the things, none of the things, whatever you want to do. I will see you in the next one.